Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. David Newhouse. He is a prominent Indigenous scholar and a professor at Trent University, where he served as the director of the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies for over 20 years. He is a member of the Onondaga Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He has dedicated his career to advancing Indigenous education, research, and governance. He is known for his leadership in promoting Indigenous knowledge systems within academia and his commitment to fostering a deeper understanding of Indigenous cultures and perspectives. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you, Gotham? It's a
I'm
beautiful day.
doing great. Yeah, and also the background that you have for your Zoom is so beautiful. And it just seems like a perfect place to actually just sit and write forever. Where is that?
Well, it's on a lake nearby, so
Oh, nice. And you are calling from where right now?
I'm calling you from Peterborough, Ontario, which is in the heart of the Williams Treaty Territory and the heart of Anishinaabe Territory in
Mm,
Ontario, just north of Lake Ontario, about 30 minutes.
nice. How long have you been there for?
I've lived in Peterborough now since 1990, so this will be coming up to 34 years.
Wow.
Yeah, prior to
Yeah,
that, I lived in Ottawa,
mm,
and then before that in London, Ontario, and then before that at Six Nations of the Grand River.
in a lot of different places all throughout Canada.
All in Southern Ontario, right?
Mm.
My home community is Six Nations of the Grand River, which is southwest of Toronto, about 45 minutes or so.
Have
It's
you
the
ever made
large.
your way to DC?
I've been to DC once in the mid 80s or so, and I
Hmm.
stayed at the Watergate Hotel.
No way.
Yeah.
That must have been before, correct? The scandal?
No, that was after the scandal. The scandal was
Oh,
in the 70s, and so yeah.
got it. I'm still working on my history. I think I was actually thinking about it a couple of days ago. I was like, I think it would be helpful to write down maybe 100 of the most important dates throughout different things in history, just so I can kind of always know where to refer. Like, okay, what happened around 1950s or 1900s? Something like that I thought would be helpful. I'm really excited for today's conversation, though. I'm excited to just explore more of your story and a lot of your work and research. So maybe we can start by, talking a little bit about how you found your interest working with Indigenous education.
I guess, I mean, I mean, where do I want to start? I guess
Hmm.
when I'd already decided I wanted to be a teacher, right? Right from public school, right? I was inspired by teachers at Six Nations in the Grand River. I grew up on the reserve. I went to public school on the reserve and had all Indigenous teachers, which was very unusual for that time, right? And they all encouraged us to pursue higher education, right? Right from grade 8 onwards as well. So I wanted to be a teacher. And I wasn't quite sure exactly what that meant at the time. And so I was in graduate school and taught a class, right? And so like that, and then decided that's what I wanted to do. So, and I wanted to teach in the area of business. And I decided that I didn't have much experience in running things, so I went out and ran my own business for a few years. I became involved in Indigenous organizations through Indigenous Friendship Centers. I served on boards of directors as president of a number of centers, became involved in fundraising, and then spent time working in government, where I was the director of housing for Indian Northern Affairs in the mid 1980s. And my job at that point was to modernize the Indian housing policy. And that at that job, I was a complete and total failure. I began to realize that creating an Indian housing market was a real challenge. At that point, the government of Canada was conservative, and that what they wanted to do was to improve the supply of housing on Indian reserves. And the way they felt that they wanted to do that was to create an Indian housing market. So I explored how one went about doing that and discovered that that's an act of social engineering because you've got to put in a lot of institutions and attitudes if you're going to uh, put in place a market.
Hmm.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to kind of touch on something you had mentioned early, which is your education, your early education, which was on the reserve, and you were taught all by Indigenous teachers. I'm really curious what you feel like your experience was and how it was different compared to many of those who may have gone to, the residential schools. What was your experience perhaps being taught by all other Indigenous folk?
It was very supportive, right? When I left the reserve to go to high school in Brantford, there's no high school on the reserve, right? At all. I felt I was better prepared, than my non-Indigenous colleagues in the school I went to. Now we grew up and we were taught in an Indigenous milieu, right? Culture was part of it, and we learned to be proud of who we were. That was one of the uh, I guess the goals of the education system. I'm a product of a system that started in the 1950s at Six Nations, in which we were, you know, expected to learn and understand our own culture, our own history, our own traditions. And so the system prepared us to do that. But at the same time, we were expected to be able to make our way in the big bad world, right, in the wider world around us. And so we were expected to be able to do that, right, using our own culture and our own traditions. And so
Hmm.
that's what I wanted to do, right, when I came to university level teachings. Because what I found was that there was a huge desire to use our own ideas, our own theories, our own notions as the basis for everyday life. And those ideas and traditions weren't part of the education that the system provided us. And so
Hmm.
what I wanted to do was to try to find ways in which I could bring those ideas, right, into this educational system. Because universities are extremely powerful institutions. They're not going to go away. They're constantly changing. They have a mission to change society, right, in addition to educating uh, members of society. But they're essentially, as I see them, as instruments of change. And I felt that we could begin to use the university to achieve some of the things that we wanted to achieve, right,
Hmm.
as Indigenous people, right, as well.
Yeah, I mean, you talk a little bit about this pride, that I think is something that's very hard to capture.
Mhm.
I think as an immigrant myself, I think one of the challenges is you talk about this wider world. When what is portrayed or represented in the wider world looks so different from who you are. I mean, I was actually just recently talking to my mom about this, that I have gone through my whole schooling. I think I had one Indian teacher in grad school. But I was just telling her, I was like, it's very different when you're taught by people who don't look like you and don't really understand the particular kind of context in which you're growing up in. And so this feeling of being proud of who you are comes really when you see people like you who are represented in a lot of positive lights. So, what was that kind of transition for you from going, being taught by all Indigenous folk, eventually going into the high school where it was no longer like that? Was it jarring in any way, or you said the transition was smooth, but I'm curious what helped that transition be smooth? Because I feel like that has the potential of being actually quite a challenging transition.
I guess in one sense, I had to learn to become very self-reliant. Right? I had to learn to uh, use my own strengths and to see myself as a strong person. Right? And that takes a lot of courage, and that also takes a lot of energy, right, as well. And and for me, what it meant was that I began to participate in the high school and in the activities of the high school as an Indigenous person. I never let people think of myself as something other than an Indigenous person. In this case, as an Iroquois person, as we saw ourselves back then. And I developed a group of friends who supported that idea of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And the same thing when I went to university, right, at the University of Western Ontario. Again, brought together a group of friends. There were 12 of us who were Indigenous at the university at that time. And we created a small association, the Native Students Association, which became a form of refuge. And we were supported by a very strong and helpful staff member. And so we found sources of support. We also created our own support for each other. And then we had enormous discussions, enormous debates about who we were, about what the future of Indigenous society was going to be, and what that would look like in that organization, right, at that time as well. So it
Mm.
was quite incredible. So in one sense, uh, I was also taught that we should never see ourselves as weak or as victims. And so I've always carried that with me. When things don't go the way that I would like them to go, I would continue to find a way to achieve what we're doing. And I sustained myself through the story that we tell ourselves up at the founding of the Iroquois Confederacy. Right, that took 40 years, right, or so. We had a young Huron man who worked consistently to unite the Five Nations, and he encountered many obstacles. But what he would do each time that he was rebuffed for bringing people together was to continue, right? Was to continue speaking, continue working, continue to bring in people together. And so he never stopped until he achieved his objectives. And
Mm.
so there are stories from our own culture, right, about how we achieve things that I used in order to sustain myself. Right? At the heart of Indigenous cultures, at least heart of Haudenosaunee culture, is the story of the Sky Woman. Right? The Sky Woman, right, lived in the world above us, and one day a hole appears in the sky. She falls through, and she's falling down to Earth, or this part of the universe. And the animals who live in this part of the universe saw her falling and decided that they wanted to help her. And so, the birds come up and create a platform for her and lower her down. The turtle offers his back for her to land on, and the animals then decide they needed to create land, so they travel into the water and eventually bring up pieces of earth, and they place it on turtle's back. So and that becomes what we call Mother Earth, right? And so what that story is a story about collaboration, a story about persistence, a story about working together, right? A story about the nature of creation, that the nature of that creation is a result of our own efforts, and that we work with others in order to do things. And so those are the ways in which I sustained myself, right? And I learned to do things for myself. I learned to work with others, right, as well. And I learned always to turn to stories in my own culture to help us to do that, okay, as well. So,
Hmm.
I mean, that's what the educational system as Six Nations helped us to do. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about what the ideal education is, it's one where it prepares you to kind of navigate any spaces. It
Mm.
abstracts enough to where you can generalize pain and suffering and jealousy and happiness. And I mean, all these really deep human experiences so that no matter where you are, you're able to like navigate it and nothing is too out of your like capacity to do.
Mhm. Yeah.
One thing, I'm really excited to talk about is I know a lot of your work has to do with modernity and indigenous modernity. I think this particular theme is really important. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but the reason I think it's really important is when we think about terms like, periods of time like the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, we look back to those times and we're able to identify and discern certain thought patterns that really influenced people of that time. As you're alive, sometimes it's hard to realize that those thought patterns also exist in your time and they're really influencing the way you view the world. But I think sometimes it's hard to be that kind of critical of what biases are playing in on your own, really large kind of understandings of the world. So I think for this reason, it's really important to actually discuss what modernity is and what some of the thoughts and kind of the thinking patterns that exist inside modernity, what they are. So first, I'd love to first ask you the question of what is modernity? And from there, if you could talk a little bit about which ideas are central to this concept, I think it would be awesome too.
I guess I see modernity as two things. One is as a structuring force, right? It's a force that structures our everyday lives and tells us how we ought to live. And when we talk about Western modernity, we talk generally in terms of reason and science and logic as being the primary ethos of, of, of modernity. And so when I began to think about modernity in terms of indigenous people, I, I encountered a set of scholars from India who were also looking at modernity. And they talked about modernities as opposed to modernity. And they brought to the table this notion that there was not just one modernity, because when we think of modernity, we always think of Western modernity, and it's an extremely strong force in the world, right? But if you look at modernity through the lens of these Indian scholars and their idea of multiple modernities, you begin to see that there's an Indian modernity, there's a Chinese modernity, right? There is a European modernity, and there are several modernities within European. The Nordic modernity and Scandinavian modernity is very different from the uh, from German modernity or English modernity, right? Latin American modernity is different. And so I begin to ask myself this question: what would an indigenous modernity in North America begin to look like? And these investigations were stimulated by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Right, in the early 90s in Canada, Canada launched this enormous Royal Commission, which looked at the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canadians. And what it did was come out for a vision of Canada, an Indigenous vision of Canada that talked about restructuring the entire country. And they look to the past and they begin to talk about what are the elements of a new relationship. And that began to uh, cause me to think about, okay, in this new relationship, what type of society are we as Indigenous people trying to build? What is it that we want our society to look like that is part of this new Canada. And that I began to look a bit about how do we then think about our history. And we've thought about our history largely through the lens of colonization. And so I talk about that period of history as the long assault, that there has been a 150-year assault upon our identities, our lands, our families, our languages, our knowledges. And that in the period 1969 to 71, that changed, and we began to speak back. And we began a period which I call the Great Healing, in which what we did was we began to say collectively, here are the objectives that we want to achieve. And a major theme of this, what has been called resurgence, is the idea of healing. And so I call the period from 71 onwards the Great Healing. And so what we are doing in this period is then rebuilding our society. And we're rebuilding our society using ideas from our own intellectual traditions and from the ideas that we encounter from the West. And let me give you an example, right? Now, a few years ago, I began to look at our own, the governance of our communities, right? In the colonial period, we encountered British forms of democracy, and the government attempted to remove all of our governments and replace them with a form of British democracy. So we've encountered democracy now for 150 or so years in its British form. But what I saw was that as Indigenous people, as we begin to govern ourselves again and regain and then rebuild our own system of governance, that people wanted to build something different. They wanted to bring traditional forms of governance back to the table. So the question is, what does that look like? And so I began to talk about something which I call Indigenous democracy. Because people didn't want to reject democracy. I did a study in 1999 with the Onondaga Nation and asked the question, what do you want your governments to look like? And they said, one person, one vote, elections. So very clearly, right, they had a commitment to democracy. But at the same time, right, they had a structured governance that was based upon clans. And so they wanted to bring that to the table, right, as well. So what does that begin to look like? And so as we begin to move forward and we begin to reestablish our governance, we're bringing elements from our traditional societal structures and forms of governance into discussion with Canadian democracy, which is, comes from British democracy. Now, there was a study that looked at First Nations band councils in Alberta, and what they found when they looked at it through the lens of Indigenous social structures was that the people who were elected to positions on the Democratic Council all came from the leadership clans. So people had found a way, right, to maintain an ethos of leadership based upon a clan system and put it together with a democratic system. Now, at the same time, right, in other parts of the country, what we began to see is that Aboriginal democracy creates political space for women, for youth, for elders, and for two-spirited people, or what one would call gay and lesbian, right, in Western society. So they created very different political space with spaces that weren't just dominated by men, but created real political spaces. And you see the emergence of women's councils, the emergence of elders' councils, the emergence of women representatives, the emergence of two-spirited representatives, right, in councils, not necessarily elected, but part of the governance process. So what
Mm.
people are trying to do then is to bring their own ideas to the table, put them together with ideas from the West, and create something that is uniquely modern, indigenous. And
Mm.
so that led me to think about, what does indigenous modernity look like? And I had a hard time getting that conversation started because everyone assumed that modernity meant assimilation and loss of culture. And so what I've been trying to do is to say that's not quite true. What it means is a fusion of bringing these two cultures together and bringing a set of ideas together and creating something entirely different. Culture isn't disappearing.
So,
Culture is changing and making something different.
yeah. So, something I want to talk a little bit more about this loss of culture because I think it's a really interesting concept.
Mhm.
And it's a really interesting kind of process that ends up happening. So we know that cultures naturally evolve through time just by, I mean, even if we take American culture and we look at how music, different forms of music and movies have changed drastically over time, what people are listening to from rock to eventually to rap and I guess my question is, to what part is that kind of transformation natural to where we're just calling it the same culture but a changing culture versus would we be considering it a culture that has now died, right? Like, how do we differentiate between a culture that has died versus a culture that has changed?
That's a good question. I guess the question, I guess the way I would answer it is if you can no longer recognize any elements of your historic culture, then you can say that it's died. And what has happened we look at Canada, right? For 150 years, the Canadian governments in various forms attempted to remove indigenous cultures and languages, right? And they did it through education, right? Through the Indian residential schools, right? So they were intended to remove any vestiges of indigeneity. In all of its forms, right? We weren't allowed to practice our own spirituality. We weren't allowed to speak our own languages. We weren't allowed to uh, learn the traditions, right? We weren't learned how to live on the land, and so the attempt was a brutal, right, repression. The culture would have changed through contact, right, naturally over time, right? I remember as students, I was teaching a first year course, and we read an article about the introduction of iron pots in a historic Mi'kmaq community. And what was interesting was that the non-Indigenous students were very upset by the introduction of these pots, which changed, right, cooking approaches, right? And they changed a whole lot of things, right, within in the Mi'kmaq society at that point. And and what happened was they said these pots should never been introduced. The indigenous student said, well, hang on just a moment, right? We wanted these pots. They made life easier for us. They allowed us to store water. They allowed us to create hot water for a whole variety of uses. And in a sense, they made life easier. And so for a long time, right, people would have seen the introduction of those pots as somehow destroying indigenous cultures. But the indigenous students were saying, hang on just a minute, it didn't change our culture. It may change some of the things that we did, the way in which we cook food, but it didn't change our culture. We never ceased to think ourselves as Mi'kmaq. We never ceased to think ourselves, right, as living on the land. Or it didn't change our relationship with the French who lived in our area, or change our relationship with the Vatican, with which they had a relationship, right? And so what the residential schools did was try to erase, right, that sense of, in the case of the Mi'kmaqness, so that it's completely and totally gone. They would no longer think of themselves as Mi'kmaq.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean this eradication of an identity is very it's a deeply kind of intellectual process as much as it is physical. Because I think you can remove a person from a place, from you can destroy their homes and so on and so forth. But so long as someone has that deep internal connection to whatever it is that their identity is, it's hard to break that. And
Mhm.
that seems to be where a lot of the more kind of brutal forms of genocide seem to be happening, where it's
Yeah.
the eradication of your connection to whatever
Mhm.
it is that you believe that you are.
Yeah.
I
So what
wanted to, yeah.
so what has happened in Canada is that the state tried in '69 one last great attempt at assimilation, and Indigenous leaders stood up and said no. And that began the period of resurgence, right, in which Indigenous people said, hang on just a minute, right? We have our own ideas. We're not going to be assimilated, and we're going to use those ideas. And they put forward a whole series of political actions to do that, that we're now, right, feeling the impacts of half a century later.
So, I mean, I have a question for you because I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. I
Mhm.
think when we think about assimilation, I think the quick kind of approach to it is how is it possible for a country to function if people are thinking different things and perhaps maybe someone holds that view. But then you do end up seeing countries that have far more diversity in their thoughts and their behaviors and their cultures. I think India is a phenomenal example of this. What do you think is a driving force behind the desire for assimilation to begin with? Why is it that there's this desire to have everyone kind of feel and behave the same way?
Fear,
Of?
pure basic fear, right, of something that is different than you, and a sense of superiority, that you have the correct answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? And you answer the way that I am. So it's
Hmm.
fear and hubris, I guess if that's the correct term, and a sense of superiority, right, that one has the answer.
Hmm.
It's interesting. And one of the core traditional indigenous teachings that is probably true across all indigenous cultures in North America is a respect for diversity and a respect for the different ways in which one can be a human being. And so, that's, I'm not saying, I mean, that's an ideal, right? And ideals are always difficult to put into practice, right, as well. And as human beings, we have enormous difficulties in doing that. We see that, right, in our own communities. It requires an incredible amount of effort in order to do that. And we, in Haudenosaunee communities, right, we talk about the Kaswanta, the two-row wampum, right? The two-row wampum uh, is a conceptualization or visualization of people living together, right? I mean, the two-row wampum is of two boats, two ships in the river, going down the river of life together. And there's a relationship between the two, right? We're all in this life together. We're connected to each other, and we're expected to treat each other with respect, with kindness, with peace, right? We're expected to do this forever. And so we ask ourselves the question, which I call this the Kaswanta question, which is at the heart of Indigenous politics based upon the Kaswantas. How do we live well together in this world at this time? And we have to answer this question over and over and over and over again. How do we live well together?
And that is an
And we do.
absolutely very important question to ask because I think something even this season has just been teaching me a lot about is how different even people that are sometimes thrown under the same label can be. I think when people think of the word indigenous, it seems as if people would fall into one kind of boat, but that's not the case at all. I mean, indigeneity, what it means in Canada is so different from what it means in Australia or from New Zealand or from Hawaii or Alaska, and it's fascinating that people are different. And I think there is something. What are some of the things that you've noticed, either taught at school or either taught just through lessons of life, of how people can work together when they are different, and not just work together when they're similar, but work together when perhaps their goals of the world could be complete opposites.
Mhm. I think that, I mean, the first thing is learning to talk to each other. And that's where it starts, right? If we don't talk to each other, then we can't work together, right, at all. Secondly, I think is trying to find some common ground, right? What is it that we share, right? What is it that we're trying to accomplish together, right? I mean, those are sort of the fundamental questions, right, as well.
Hmm. So I wanted to talk a little bit more. We talked about modernity, which kind of seems to be this conglomeration of Western ideals and indigenous ways of life, and this merge. And there's kind of this, emergence of just indigeneity in Canada since 1971, which takes part of this healing and this rebuilding. One part of this that you do a lot of work in is the economic development aspect of this rebuilding. So first, I think economic development seems like a pretty complex concept. So first, we can just break that down. What exactly does economic development look like?
Well, it's taken many forms in Canada, but at the heart, economic development is about nation building. It's about the creation of collective wealth, about individual wealth, and also about sharing and equitable distribution of wealth. Right? So economic development is intended to help us to live well together. It's intended to help us to share the resources that we find around us as well. And it takes different forms, right, in different places, right? And we're seeing on the West Coast, we have fishing economies. On the East Coast, we have fishing economies, right? On the prairies, we have farming economies. Right? We're now beginning to see the emergence of uh, economies based upon gaming, huge discussion on gaming, right, as well. Another sector that's beginning to develop is cannabis. We're beginning to see production of cannabis, right? And cannabis is now replacing cigarettes. And so, I always remember my cousin who was a cigarette manufacturer, and he was getting a lot of criticism from the community because he was amassing a whole lot of individual wealth. And so the question I was beginning to have to grapple with is, am I going to have a social license to continue? Right? How do I continue to operate my business, right, in consistent, right, with the values of the community, which are about sharing, which are about not amassing great personal wealth? How do I give back to the community, right? And those are the questions that he had to grapple with, right? And so, what he did was he set up a a shuttle service for elders as a way of giving back to the community. He used the shuttle service to take elders who didn't have cars, right? Who didn't have relatives, to doctor's appointments or shopping for groceries. So, in a sense, right, even as a business person, he was expected to operate in accordance with traditional Haudenosaunee values. But he could not
Mm,
escape, right, from those, right?
yeah. So, one, I really want to highlight something I think you mentioned there that I think is very different than how people typically think of economic development. But from what I heard you say, it sounded like you were talking a little bit about how people, when living in these communities, don't necessarily look at economic success as simply an individualistic journey, where it's like economic development is when we all kind of are able
That's
to, function at, I guess, at a
mhm,
economically more advanced state. So I have this question. It's a little bit more theoretical. I'm not sure if I'll be able to word it properly, but it's been something I've always been curious about. So when we think about economic development from like a community perspective, like we want us all to rise. Let's say what that ends up seeming like is everyone kind of falls into these communities. It just seems like you then end up having the same issues we have now, but instead of having individual actors, you now have these larger groups of people as communities just simply doing the same vying for resources that we have now, but it would just be done at the community level.
mhm,
So, how does that lead to any different of kind of a world than what we have right now, except instead of individual actors being the ones who are wealthy, it would just be slightly larger communities, but the same inequalities would persist.
mhm. Well, I think two things. One is one doesn't see the inequality as a result of one's lack of interest or lack of ability. Right? In the West, right, if you go to America, right, inequality is seen as a lack of initiative. Right? So so these communities then begin to think about how do you begin to create a more equitable or sharing economy. And so, right, they begin to create these things like my cousin did, right, as well, to do that. Now, that's not going to stop all of the debates about resources, right? I mean, economists tell us very much that if there is a resource constraint, there's going to be a debate, right? So the question is, how does that debate occur, right, as well. And what are the principles for that debate? And what you see emerging in indigenous communities is a question of sustainability or ethic of sustainability, in that extreme disparities in wealth is not a sustainable approach. And so the question becomes, okay, how do we ensure that everyone in this community, right, has the ability to live well, right? And what do they need to live well? And how can we ensure, right, that as well? How can we ensure that we have the institutions that help us to do that? And that's a big challenge, right, as well. And
Mm.
and you can't get rid of the debate entirely, but you can moderate the debate as well, and ensure that it doesn't become a winner take all type of debate. But
Mm.
you have to bring to the table, right, the ethic of sustainability. Right? We all of us have to live not just today, but in the future. And so what Haudenosaunee communities have done is bring to the table this idea of 7 generations. That when we make decisions, we have to think about the impact of that upon 7 generations. That's a long time frame, and that's a very high ideal, right? So we can't think just of ourselves. We have to think of the impact of our actions upon the 7 generations, the generation coming after us. But at the same time, right, when you begin to think about who is impacted by our decisions, you can't think of just about the people. You also have to think about the environment, right? The land, the water, the air, the animals. And so you are then required to consider all of those other than human, right, aspects of existence in your decision making. And so broadening the field, right, of impact becomes the way in which you also moderate, right, the debate.
Hmm. So, in some of your coursework, because you were working with the university and building out the curriculum, and
Mhm.
in thinking about this form of awareness when it comes to economic development, not only thinking about yourself, not only thinking about the community, but also thinking about people moving forward for at least a few hundred years,
Mhm.
what were some of the things you felt like you did differently in the coursework that would kind of enhance this form of thinking?
A lot of collaborative work, right, as well. I mean that's extremely important. And then secondly is asking people to talk about the values and talk about how they would translate those values into actions. What are they going to do to protect the waters? What are they going to do to protect the land? What are they going to do to protect the animals, right? And make those parts explicit, make those themes explicit, right, as well. Secondly, I think is making people aware of the rules by which they live and by which society works, right? I use this game called Star Power, right? And it's a trading game, right? And it's a game in which you use poker chips and you set the rules for trading. And then you rig the rules so that one group begins to amass all the wealth. And you play the game until there's rebellion, right? And so at one point, what happens is that and it's always happened every time I've done the game over 20 years, is the group that has the wealth makes rules that that work for them, but don't work for people who are who have absolutely no resources, have lost all their chips. And then you then begin to talk about that game in the context of everyday life and the economic system that we're part of. And you ask the students to talk about how do they feel, right, when they had no resources and they saw this other group, right, beginning to make the rules. And then you talk to the group who made the rules. How did you feel, right, as well? What did you see, right? Why did you do what you do? And you start this conversation that illuminates the rules. And hopefully, right, it has a long-term transformative impact. But a Cree elder, right, said, you see through the rules until you see through the rules. And so, I try to teach my students that our behaviors are affected by social forces, and that unless we understand the social forces that affect our lives and that are determining our behaviors, then we are prisoners and that we're robots and we have no free will. They don't like that. And that makes them very frightened because they've been taught they have a lot of free will, right, as well. But when I say, your behavior is determined, right, by forces outside of your consciousness. And I have an experience that I ask the students to go and stand in a public spot. Just go and stand, right, for 20 minutes. Doesn't matter where it is, right? Just go and stand. And then come back and do nothing, right? And then come back and report. So the next week they come back and report. And what was interesting was they all said that was the most challenging thing they could ever do. One young man said, I could not stand still because I could not be seen to be doing nothing. So I asked the question, okay, where did you get this idea? And he talked about his father. He talked about his father, who was a businessman, who said, you can never be seen to be lazy. You've always got to be doing something. And so he learned something about himself, right? Another person who was tall, he was about 6'5" and black, went and stood in the Walmart entryway. And he said, I couldn't do it, right? Because the greeters, the guards, right, came and began to look at me and began to wonder what I was doing and began, right, to begin to move me out, right, as well. Others said, I had to smoke, so I could not be seen to be doing nothing, right, as well. And so, as they began, and there were several exercises like that in which I helped the students to understand the social forces that are affecting their lives.
Could you give a few more examples? That was a phenomenal example.
The other, and this, the other exercise that I use is one based upon the medicine circle, right? Which I don't know whether you know much about medicine circles, but it is a fundamental Onondaga teaching, right? And the medicine circle is a way of thinking about health, about community, right? Because what it says, a circle is comprised, the Onondaga says that a healthy human being is comprised of four elements: a body, a mind, a set of emotions, and a spirit. And that a healthy human being has all of these that are in balance. And that the wheel is always in motion. So it's always moving. And so when we're healthy, we're like tops and we spin, right? Easily. When we're unhealthy, we wobble. And so what you can do is use the medicine circle as a way of, of diagnosing an unhealthy situation. We use it in community development to think about communities. Communities have a physical location, they have an economy, they have a culture, right, and they have a spirit. And we can use the same model as a way of helping us to think about how we want to approach community development or economic development, right, and diagnose problems or prepare solutions. So we can then begin to use, right, ideas from our own culture, right, in order to create solutions, right, within our own culture as well.
Hmm.
And so I
Yeah.
ask the students, right, to look at their own lives, right, and to list the things they do to keep their bodies healthy, keep their minds healthy, their emotions healthy, and their spirits healthy, right? And I said, you know, and it helps them to understand themselves in that in ways that an unautonomic person would see themselves, and then to begin to think about, okay, what do they want to do, right?
Hmm.
The third exercise is one that I call the thankfulness exercise, right? And now, indigenous spirituality is about gratitude and about thankfulness. In Haudenosaunee cultures, right, in Haudenosaunee communities, we begin every meeting with the Thanksgiving address, in which we start with ourselves and we go through all the elements of creation and give thanks. It helps us to orient ourselves, right, to the universe. It tells us that we're not alone. It tells us we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And so what I do with the students is I ask them to uh, draw a circle on the page, and then around the circle to list all of those people's, animals, spirits, electronic beings that have helped them to get where they are today. Right? And it's interesting to see, right? Because they think of themselves largely as self-made. And so they suddenly see themselves as part of this large community, right? Large network of beings, human, non-human, electronic. And I include electronic beings because we have Siri and Alexa and all these things these days, right? As
Hmm.
well. And animals as well. And so, and then what I do is I have them then thank all of those beings, human, non-human, electronic, in whatever way they can, right? And come back and report on what happened as a result of that as well.
Hmm.
And so if we're teaching, right, about indigenous economic development, and one of the fundamental aspects of indigenous community is this idea of connectedness, the idea of community, that we're all in this together, that we're not alone, that when we think of decisions, we think of others as part of our community and even beyond, then we need a series of exercises that take our students from where they are in thinking about themselves as autonomous, single disconnected human beings to a situation where they see themselves as connected, as part of something larger, right?
Mm.
As well, right?
And I
So
think what's beautiful about all of these projects is that it requires the student to do a lot of the introspection themselves. There's no kind of like direction being told necessarily of what insights come from these activities. I think it's
that's
something
right.
that can be different and personal for each person, which I think is what's so beautiful about something like this.
That's right. And the students have a great deal of challenge with it, because it's in terms of education, right? What we're asking them to do is to reveal something of themselves, to look at themselves and look at their own behaviors and connect it to something larger and to see themselves differently,
Mhm.
as opposed to just receiving information, solving problems. Right?
100%.
I mean, those things are important. I'm not saying they're not important, but if we're going to use our own ideas, right, then we have to think about how do we get those ideas, right, into the classroom so that's in a way that students can engage with them. And
Yeah.
experiential learning is the way in which we do that, right? And that's the way
Yeah.
elders teach, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so much in this conversation that I'm excited to listen back to, starting from talking about modernity and the mixing of cultures and that creating something new and the revitalization of culture into talking about economic development and the importance of that. And then finally getting into some of the education aspects of how do we actually go about teaching some of these things that are so critical to what it means to be Indigenous. So, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insights. I think there was a lot of really good ideas here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.